Okay, we're going to finish up muscle tonight, and it's a difficult subject, but I'm going to make this a little easier from this slide on, because this is kind of hard to understand. You got to bring everything into what we learned already. So I'm just going to move on a little bit. I mean, we're going to go back to this. We're going to go back to the cross bridges and the power strokes and the hydrolysis and all the steps of muscle contraction. I'm going to go through that very slowly with you later. But for the rest of this recording, I just want to go into the way we make ATP in the muscle. The way we take glucose, we take oxygen, and we make as much ATP as we can in the skeletal muscle, because you need ATP. And of course, you need oxygen. So this is the source. So there's different ways. There's what's called direct phosphorylation. Now that is taking ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then adding a phosphate to make your ATP. And that is an anabolic reaction, endergonic, where you need water. So it's a dehydration synthesis reaction. And you need an enzyme called ATP synthase. Okay, I just have to clear something for a second, sorry. Okay, so this is ATP, by the way, not ATA. So ATP synthase is used. So you could just directly phosphorylate. Now you're only going to make one ATP from that, one ATP, and you'll see the different methods make more ATP as you go. Then you have anaerobic pathway, which is no oxygen, right? Anaerobic is no oxygen. So that's not going to make a lot. We'll see how much it nets. And that's about 2 ATP. So that's glycolysis and lactic acid cycle or formation is anaerobic. You don't need oxygen for that. The aerobic pathway is with oxygen, and that's going to involve the mitochondria. And you're going to make a lot of ATP with that. Whereas like glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, muscle cell, right? Or I should say, let's say sarcoplasm, right? Don't forget that sarco. See that come up in your questions. So all this is anaerobic, no oxygen needed. Short duration of contraction, very fatigable, right? But the aerobic pathway will last longer because there's so much more ATP made. At least 3 times more ATP is made in the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria through aerobic pathways. So this is creatine phosphate. This is another way we make, again, 1 ATP. So creatine phosphate will donate that phosphate to ADP, and this is again anaerobic. This is anaerobic, so it doesn't make a lot of ATP. It does it quickly though. Again, your creatine phosphate is always present in your sarcoplasm, always ready to make that little bit of ATP, right? So creatine kinase is the enzyme that makes that transfer from the creatine, the phosphate in creatine phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make ATP. So this direct phosphorylation, not oxidative phosphorylation. So we saw direct phosphorylation with ATP synthase, and then you saw it now with creatine phosphate. So remember, creatine phosphate is anaerobic, making ATP without the presence of oxygen in the cytoplasm. Here's the enzyme. So just using your creatine phosphate, you could power a muscle cell for contraction like 15 seconds, right? So that's basically just getting started on a sprint, right? 15 seconds, unless you're fast like Jeremiah, and you could run the 55 in, less than 15 seconds, right? So it doesn't give you a long period of time, but enough to do a sprint or a few reps, bench press, or run up the stairs real quick, right? Not enough to keep going though. you need to get other sources of ATP. All right, so here's the basic formula for that, and the creatine kinase does this. Right? So the byproduct is creatine. So your kidney has to deal with this, right? And it's hopefully will recycle it, and it'll make more creatine phosphate for the muscle, skeletal muscle we're talking about, right? So this is direct phosphorylation, which is just adding a phosphate to ADP. That's all that means, direct phosphorylation, whether it's creatine phosphate or it's just ADP, right? It's a couple of different enzymes. So that, again, the sarcoplasm is constantly recycling this ADP to ATP. Very important. Now, glycolysis is basically splitting glucose. It's breaking glucose in half, and that's exactly what it is. Right? It'll take glucose and make two molecules called pyruvic acid. So glucose is split in the sarcoplasm anaerobically by glycolysis. That's the name of the process. It'll give you two pyruvates or pyruvic acid. Same thing, okay? So through glycolysis, we're going to gain 2 ATPs. That's not a lot, really. I think a muscle cell aerobically, I see what your book says, which it's usually about 32 compared to this. There's only 2, because this is anaerobic, right? Anaerobic. So again, lactic acid, basically lactic acid is a byproduct of glycolysis, right? Pyruvic acid is going to enter the mitochondria, right? Or the breakdown of it will enter the mitochondria. Then it'll undergo aerobic respiration. But if there is no oxygen, what happens is called fermentation. Like when you make wine, you ferment it, right? And this is also anaerobic glycolysis if there's no oxygen involved. And that produces lactic acid. And that'll go back into the blood. This won't go into the mitochondria, right? So let's get this straight, the anaerobic part, before we go into the aerobic respiration. So you figure if you're not going to do anything for a long period of time, you're just going to do, say, a 55-meter sprint, right, which is less than a minute. So the first thing your sarcoplasms are going to do to make ATP, to get that muscle contraction going with the myosin heads being energized and all that, is direct phosphorylation of creatine phosphate and ADP. So that's only going to make like 3 ATP. So that won't last long. It's like, if you go to Atlantic City and you're walking around with $10 in your pocket, you can how much blackjack did you really play, right, Natalia? You can't really play that much. But if you go a little further, glycolysis will get you a little bit further, maybe another $20 or so. So that'll make maybe another 2 ATPs. So that'll give you a little bit more time, like 35 seconds or, of ATP. So you can, before you consume it. Now, anaerobically, the lactic acid is a byproduct of glycolysis, and lactic acid will go into the bloodstream. Like, did you ever exercise or stand up for a long time and you feel like a pain in your muscles or a kind of like a soreness? Especially if you lifted weights and you start to feel burning after a few repetitions. It depends on what condition you're in. So that is basically lactic acid going into your blood and affecting your pain receptors. But lactic acid is completely appropriate. It can be converted back to pyruvic acid later, and it can be used for energy, to make ATP, I should say. So there's no oxygen present when all this is happening. So now if you need to go a little further, then of course you take in more oxygen and you use the oxygen in the mitochondria. So the lactic acid has nothing to do with aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen. So the breakdown of pyruvic acid will go into the mitochondria, and then in the presence of oxygen, and then you're going to make a lot more ATP, and that's more for extended periods of time, like from over a minute to hours, as long as oxygen is present and you're not using the anaerobic pathways anymore. So it's like like when you hear anaerobic versus aerobic. Like anaerobic is more your powerlifting, right? Or you're sprinting or quick swim, where aerobic is more, doing a cross country, going to, or a marathon, or going to, or doing a triathlon, something that's going to keep moving, keep using oxygen. So again, think about how long it takes, how much mitochondria you need, how much blood supply you need, how much glucose you're going to need, because glucose starts the whole process. It starts out as anaerobic, and then it's the breakdown of glycolysis used for aerobic. So that's a really a big concept there that you have to get. Okay, so lactic acid will go into the blood, right, and it can be used for fuel for other, processes in the body. Right, you don't really want to use lactic acid for your heart, right? We only when there's no oxygen. But other parts like the liver, your smooth muscle cells use lactic acid and anaerobic respiration all the time. But your brain needs glucose, and your brain needs oxygen, and your heart does too. Your heart does too. It can use lactic acid, but you don't want that to get to that point. Okay, so lactic acid, the liver can convert it back to pyruvic acid and then go in, to glucose, which can be recycled. So lactic acid can be recycled as long as it keeps running through your blood. Okay. So 5% as much ATP as aerobic respiration, right? But it produces it faster. You don't have to know that. Okay, so this is showing the anaerobic pathway. So glucose comes into the cell, right? You need insulin for that, don't forget. Or you have to break down glycogen, which is our storage form of glucose, right? So in the cytosol, which is really the sarcoplasm, glycolysis will yield net 2 ATPs, because it costs you a couple of ATPs to go through glycolysis, actually. So 2 pyruvic acid plus lactic acid, really, because ultimately you'll get lactic acid. Now, if there's no oxygen present, that'll be released into the blood, right? So the products are basically 2 ATPs and some lactic acid. So just a little less than a minute with glycolysis of ATP use, and you'll fatigue those muscles that you're using very quickly for those activities. So aerobic respiration is 95% of the ATP is made in the presence of oxygen. That's what aerobic means, in the presence of oxygen. Right? And there's a series of chemical reactions in the mitochondria, and I'll tell you what they're called because this might come up. In the mitochondria, you have 2 things. One thing is called the Krebs cycle, also known as the tricarboxylic acid cycle, and also known as the citric acid cycle. So your book says all. And also the electron transport chain. And this is really where all the ATP is made, in the electron transport chain, which is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And there's a lot of oxidation reduction reactions that give off enough energy to build ATP. And the energy is basically in the form of heat from electrons going from one level to another. And it's all based on hydrogens. You don't have to know that, but know the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle involve aerobic respiration, and this all happens in the mitochondria. Okay, so in the presence of oxygen. So ultimately, you're going to get some carbon dioxide, some water, and this is 1 molecule of glucose that's doing this, some water, and about 32 ATP. So that's a lot more than you're getting from direct phosphorylation and glycolysis. I'll tell you that, my friends, or from creatine phosphate. All right, so this is important. So we want to use glucose. And of course, we store glycogen in the muscle. All right, remember, there's myoglobin and there's glycogen in skeletal muscle, because that's what we need. We need glucose, we need oxygen for extended muscle contraction. All right, and you get, of course, glucose from the blood. And if there's not enough available glucose, you're going to use fatty acids, right, which isn't ideal, but it makes a lot of ATP, I'll tell you that. And this can be converted back to pyruvic acid. Remember, pyruvic acid is the products of glycolysis that goes into the mitochondria, right? So fatty acids can be used too, and that could be 30 minutes of exercise, easy. So here's the aerobic pathway. I like these. This book does a nice job here. So the energy source is glucose. It could go into the mitochondria, which is really pyruvic acid. You could put fatty acids in there. You could put amino acids, but we never want to use amino acids here. If we had to, if you were starving, your body's going to break down itself, its muscle and bone, and put that into the mitochondria in the form of amino acids. Well, technically, the amino acids will be converted to pyruvic acid. So basically, this is all anaerobic respiration here, right? The anaerobic part. And that's how many ATPs? Maybe 4 max, 3 to 4 ATPs through anaerobic. And then once the pyruvic acid and the byproducts of pyruvic acid go into the mitochondria, go through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, they're two separate things. You're going to make a heck of a lot of ATP, right? And the byproduct of all this is it's kind of a waste product. Let's call it what it is. It's a waste product. And water is always involved with this. So this is why they call it respiration, because oxygen is going into the mitochondria, or it could be pyruvic acid, of course, but oxygen goes into the mitochondria, and pyruvic acid go into the mitochondria, and you wind up with 32 ATPs. Sometimes it's even more, right? So the problem is, that's not a problem, but what the byproduct, just like any respiration, CO2 is given off at the end of this. So CO2 is going to go back into the blood. And when you learn respiratory, it's important to remove that CO2 by exhaling ultimately. So the blood vessels, the heart, especially the left side of the heart, is delivering all this oxygen blood to your tissue, like skeletal muscle. And then skeletal muscle uses that oxygen and glucose, of course, or it can use fatty acids, doesn't want to, and then make all this ATP. This is really important in skeletal muscle. It's important in cardiac muscle. So oxygen in the skeletal muscle, oxygen is stored in the skeletal muscle. So listen to this recording. Stored as or in myoglobin. So that's the skeletal muscle storage of oxygen, myoglobin. And then glucose is stored as glycogen. Okay, so glycogen is in the skeletal muscle. It's also in the liver. So glycogen is stored in the liver and skeletal muscle. That's what you need to know right now. So basically the end products of this is all this ATP, which really is, you got to add these now, right? So this could be 36 ATPs total with 1 molecule of glucose. It's a lot of ATP. Skeletal muscle is very efficient at making ATP. Not every cell can do this. This is all skeletal muscle. So that you get all this ATP total from 1 molecule of glucose, you get some water, and then you get about 6 CO2s and six water molecules. So the CO2 is going to go back into the blood to be brought to the lungs to be exhaled out. Really important. So now let's talk about like more practical things like using energy during certain sports. And I've kind of been alluding to this, right? Aerobic versus anaerobic. So endurance, how long you can go without fatiguing, basically. And the threshold, like when is enough ATP used where it's not anaerobic anymore. You have to go into different pathways. So the endurance is how long that muscle can contract. And with that, you need ATP. So that's what training is all about, right? Being able to use that ATP and work on your cardiovascular health as far as bringing the oxygen in, right? And of course, diet is important. So this can go on for hours, right? Because remember, every molecule of glucose that goes into that muscle cell, and there's many, many, many muscle cells, make up to 32 ATPs just from aerobic respiration, right? So now anaerobic threshold is to the point when you used up all your creatine phosphate, you used up all your, you already went through glycolysis, right? There's no more glucose available, right? So that would be much shorter period of time, but that's going to convert to an anaerobic pathway. So if you start running and you expect to run 5 miles or 5K, the first mile or so for you, if you're in shape, is going to be mostly anaerobic, right? Mostly anaerobic, right? So basically, this is wrong. This is supposed to be saying aerobic pathway. That's supposed to be saying aerobic, not anaerobic, right there. All right, so it's going to have to convert. So if you're running like the first mile and you're using your, or less, whatever time you have, like say a few minutes, right, of if you're in shape, anaerobic pathways, then you start breathing a little heavier, and then you have to kick into your aerobic pathways. So there's a threshold which changes as far as how you consume oxygen. For me, I would need it after 55 meters. For some of you, maybe after a mile. So it really does depend. So you can see, the first 6 seconds is just that creatine phosphate, or the first 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And then you go into more glycogen keeps getting released and you get more glucose. And then you stop the exercise. So that's all anaerobic, short duration, like a sprint, or doing like reps of squats for 10, 15 reps. But then if it's prolonged, and then it's more about your aerobic pathways, your Krebs cycles, your electron transport really makes most of the ATP. So we'll talk a little bit about fatigue. So now it pretty much, like last time was kind of complicated. We went over the muscle twitches and the fused tetanus and unfused tetanus and summation. So a muscle can't keep contracting. There's no way, no how. It's going to fatigue, right? You either run out of ATP, creatine phosphate, or you're going to run low in calcium, and of course your sodium, potassium for depolarization and repolarization. Calcium, which binds to troponin and allows the tropomyosin to come off the binding sites on actin for myosin. So again, the sarcoplasmic reticulum has to regenerate and keep pumping, right? But it can only go so far. So muscle fatigue is when all this stops, right? So you don't have to worry about increased magnesium. So as the ATP levels drop, you have an increase in magnesium, and it kind of stops everything, right? It stops everything. Okay. So you don't fatigue, with your postural muscles unless you're, standing up for hours and hours and hours. Probably like a lot of you do when you work, right? So again, you have to repay that debt, that oxygen debt that you consumed. So again, oxygen, as you rest, the oxygen reserves are replenished. The myoglobin is replenished. The lactic acid that's in your blood is converted back to pyruvic acid, which can be converted to glucose in the cell. Your glycogen is now storing, so you're loading more glycogen by having something, maybe a starch, something that's high in polysaccharide, and that'll be converted to glycogen from all the glucose. Not simple sugars, that's not really a helpful thing. So more complex carbohydrates will help replenish your glycogen. So then back to ATP is going to be synthesized more with direct phosphorylation. Creatine phosphate will build up, CP will build up in your sarcoplasms again. So again, it requires oxygen, of course, now oxygen again. So the use of all this oxygen is post-exercise oxygen consumption, and that forms a debt. But again, you could pay it back with skeletal muscle. You could rest. You fill in your reserves with glycogen and nutrients and water, of course. Hold on one second. So we're going to talk about the different fiber types. And muscles have all of these types, right? So we're going to talk about slow twitch. I'll call them twitch. Slow twitch fibers. And fast twitch fibers. Sometimes it's just called fast fibers and slow fibers. So the slow fibers are called oxidative. And they're darker. So here's the deal. Slow twitch fibers, and they could be in your quadriceps or your pectoralis, mostly in your quadriceps. They're oxidative, meaning they use more oxygen, which means they're going to be more for aerobic respiration, and they're going to be less fatigable. So these slow twitch fibers are less fatigable. And they're darker because there's more mitochondria. More myoglobin. And more blood supply. But they're kind of thinner. They're not thick. And they're also less powerful than the fast twitch fibers. Now, the fast twitch fibers are pretty much the opposite. They're what's called glycolytic. So there's less oxygen needed. There's no oxygen. It's anaerobic, right? Where this is slow twitch or aerobic. Fast twitch fibers are lighter, thicker, and more powerful. So every muscle group has slow twitch fibers, fast twitch fibers. Every muscle group has dark fibers and light fibers. I'm not talking about actin and myosin here. It's nothing to do with that. All right, so these are fast twitch fibers are more fatigable. We'll go through debt faster. So think about this. And again, you have an in-between too. There could be like slow or fast oxidative glycolytic too, kind of in between. But I just want you to get these two down. So let me ask you, which are you going to use more of when you're doing like a 8-rep bench press? More fast twitch or slow twitch fibers? Say for about 10 seconds or less. Which one do you think?
Is it fast?
Yeah, for sure. So fast twitch fibers are recruited more for your power movements or your short duration. Because look, it has more fatigable fibers. It has less mitochondria, less blood, and less myoglobin. So for oxidative, this is more for your marathon running, your cross country. So these fibers have more mitochondria, more myoglobin, and more blood. That's why they're darker. But they're thinner and less powerful, right? You don't need powerful muscles to run a marathon. You need thick, powerful muscles to, to play, offensive guard on a line in a football game, right? For that short period of heavy bursts under extreme weight against you. So the power lifter, more in the fast twitch fibers are used. In the Ironman or the triathlete, it's more slow twitch fibers are recruited. Sometimes both, right? So you start out, like the girl who's running, she starts out with her fast twitch fibers. She's using glycolysis. That's why this is called glycolytic. And then she's making the lactic acid going into her blood, but then she runs out of that anaerobic ATP, and then the aerobic cascade has to start as she's going for half an hour, 3 hours, 4 hours. And that's, of course, is going to cause oxygen debt too. Eventually, you're going to have oxygen debt. But that's why you train. That's why you build up that cardiovascular, better cardiac output, which you'll learn. And you have a maximum cardiac output, and you have a cardiac reserve. So your cardiac reserve gets better. The use of oxygen, the use of the better blood flow, the stronger contractions of the heart, better cardiac output is really what the ultimate goal is there.